This little vehicle, no one took it seriously. The German generals laughed. Looks like a toy. No armor, no cannon, just a small machine. But what they didn't know was that, within months, this very toy would be standing beneath the walls of their own fortress. This is the story of that iron-willed machine, built not from steel, but from determination. A machine that rewrote the rules of war. It was a gray, rain-soaked morning somewhere along the Western Front, 1943. Mud clung to boots, engines groaned under the weight of war, and the once proud steel beasts of the Wehrmacht stood idle, their treads swallowed by the earth they sought to conquer. From a distance, a convoy approached, not with the thunder of panzers, but with the light whir of small engines. German officers raised their binoculars, expecting to see something worthy of their disdain, and what they saw brought laughter through the cold air. A tiny American vehicle, box-shaped and unimpressive, bounced through the ruts and craters with soldiers hanging off its sides. Ein Spielzeug, one of them scoffed. A toy. That, they thought, was what the Americans called military engineering. But what the German commanders could not have imagined was that this small, unassuming machine would become one of the most important weapons of the war, not through firepower, but through sheer adaptability, endurance, and heart. The story of the Jeep begins long before that laughter echoed across the battlefields of Europe. In 1940, as the United States watched the fires of war spread across Europe and Asia, its military planners faced a simple but critical problem: mobility. The armies of the world relied on horses, motorcycles, and bulky trucks to move men and supplies, but the modern battlefield demanded something faster, lighter, and more versatile. The U.S. Army called for a new kind of vehicle, a lightweight reconnaissance car that could carry men, tow guns, climb hills, cross rivers, and do it all with the speed of a cavalry horse. It was an impossible wish list, but the war had a way of turning impossibilities into necessity. The call went out to America's automobile industry. 135 companies received the specifications. Only 3 answered the challenge: American Bantam, Willys Overland, and Ford. Bantam, a tiny carmaker on the brink of bankruptcy, moved first. In just 49 days, its engineers worked day and night to build a prototype, the Bantam reconnaissance car. It was crude, underpowered, and rushed, but it proved that the concept could work. The Army was impressed but worried about Bantam's capacity to produce thousands of units. So they handed the design to Willys and Ford, who refined it, toughened it, and brought it to life. By 1941, the Jeep was born, officially designated the Willys MB. The first soldiers to drive it didn't see it as just a vehicle. They saw a partner. It could do things no truck, no horse, no tank could. It climbed hills like a goat, crossed mud like a tank, and rolled through water, snow, and sand without complaint. Soldiers nicknamed it the GI's best friend. It carried troops into battle, hauled wounded men to safety, towed artillery, laid telephone lines, and even pulled planes out of the mud. It wasn't pretty, but it was pure function. Every bolt, every curve had a purpose. It could start in freezing cold, keep going in desert heat, and be fixed with a hammer and a wrench. Soon, Jeeps were everywhere: North Africa, Italy, the Pacific Islands, Normandy, and beyond. For every tank that rolled, there were 10 Jeeps supporting it. Commanders rode them to the front lines, generals used them as mobile offices, and medics turned them into ambulances. The Germans couldn't understand it. They had their Kübelwagen, sleek and engineered with precision, but it was no match for the rugged, relentless American Jeep. The Germans mocked its shape, its simplicity, but they couldn't deny what they saw: the Jeep never stopped. By the time American forces stormed North Africa in 1942, the Jeep had become a symbol of mobility and speed. It carried messages across deserts, moved special forces under the cover of night, and even led armored columns through terrain tanks couldn't reach. Its flat hood served as a field desk, a stretcher, a dining table, and a command post. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a way of life for the men who fought with it. And the enemy began to take notice. Reports came in from captured German officers who spoke in disbelief. One German colonel reportedly said, "The Americans build these like we build bullets, endless and unstoppable." Wherever the Wehrmacht dug in, Jeeps found a way around. Whenever supply lines were bombed, Jeeps carried what planes couldn't. Their light frames made them ideal for airborne drops. They were literally parachuted into battle. From the sands of El Alamein to the snow of the Ardennes, the Jeep became an extension of the American soldiers' will to move, adapt, and survive. In the eyes of German commanders, this tiny box on wheels began to represent something far more dangerous than firepower. It represented a philosophy, that victory belonged not just to those with the biggest guns, but to those who could move faster, react quicker, and reach farther. While the Germans obsessed over perfect engineering and heavy armor, the Americans focused on practicality. The Jeep was the embodiment of that mindset, simple, durable, efficient, and everywhere at once. When German soldiers finally faced Jeeps up close, they realized it wasn't the vehicle's design that made it deadly, it was the way it multiplied the strength of every unit that used it. A single Jeep could deliver reinforcements, ammo, and medical aid faster than any traditional supply line. It became the bloodstream of Allied operations. Without the Jeep, offensives would stall, communication would falter, and rescue would arrive too late. With it, the Allies were mobile and unstoppable. By the end of the war, the Germans no longer laughed. They watched as convoys of Jeeps rolled through liberated towns, flags waving, soldiers smiling, civilians cheering. The Jeep had outlasted tanks, planes, and strategies. It had become a legend, the most versatile machine of the Second World War. It carried generals like Eisenhower and Patton, spies, medics, and ordinary soldiers. It was the unsung hero of victory, the steel companion that asked for nothing and gave everything. In the blazing heat of North Africa, the Jeep found its true calling. Under the relentless desert sun, where tanks overheated and trucks bogged down in soft sand, the little four-wheel drive proved unstoppable. It raced across dunes like a desert fox, kicking up trails of dust that marked the advance of a new kind of warfare, fast, flexible, and fearless. British and American units of the Desert Rats and the newly formed U.S. II Corps began using Jeeps for reconnaissance, raids, and supply runs. Their ability to dart in and out of enemy lines turned them into ghosts on wheels. German patrols reported mysterious hit-and-run attacks that vanished into the dunes before counterfire could be organized. What the Germans thought was reckless improvisation was in fact deliberate strategy, speed over strength, motion over mass. The Jeep's light frame and short wheelbase allowed it to climb slopes where even half-tracks failed. Mechanics stripped them down, added extra fuel cans, machine guns, and even anti-tank rifles. The long-range desert group and the newly formed SAS transformed the Jeep into a weapon of pure mobility, striking deep behind enemy lines and melting back into the desert before sunrise. The Germans began to realize that the small American car they once mocked had become a symbol of Allied unpredictability. As the campaigns moved from the deserts of Africa to the hills of Italy, the Jeep kept pace. It crawled up mountain passes under artillery fire, ferried ammunition through rubble-filled streets, and carried chaplains, doctors, and generals alike. When supply trucks could not reach frontline troops, Jeeps went where roads no longer existed. They forded rivers, crossed bomb craters, and hauled everything from mortars to milk. Soldiers spoke of them as if they were living things, stubborn, loyal, always willing to go a little farther. Some Jeeps were given nicknames, painted with pin-up art or hometown slogans. Others bore scars of shrapnel yet kept running. The bond between soldier and machine deepened with every mile, for the Jeep did not merely carry men, it carried morale. In the winter of 1943, Allied planners prepared for the invasion of Europe. Operation Overlord would demand the largest movement of men and machines in history, and once again the humble Jeep was at the center of the plan. Its small size meant thousands could be shipped overseas and landed on the beaches within hours of the first assault. Engineers designed waterproofing kits so Jeeps could wade through chest-deep surf. On June 6, 1944, as dawn broke over Normandy, hundreds of these vehicles churned through sand and smoke. Amid the chaos of artillery and machine gun fire, they delivered medics, ammunition, and radio operators to the scattered units fighting to secure the beachhead. A sergeant later wrote, "When I saw that little Jeep crawling out of the surf with a Red Cross flag on the hood, I knew we had a chance." Behind the front lines, Jeeps became the arteries of the invasion. They carried engineers to build bridges, intelligence officers to scout new routes, and photographers who recorded history frame by frame. Their engines hummed through hedgerows and villages that had not heard freedom's sound in 4 long years. Everywhere they went, children waved, women cried, and soldiers grinned from ear to ear. The sight of a Jeep rolling through town meant liberation had arrived. Even Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, once remarked that the Jeep was one of the 3 tools that won the war, the others being the DC-3 airplane and the landing craft. German field reports from France tell a story of growing frustration. Commanders complained that American light vehicles appeared, as if from nowhere, supplying troops faster than the Wehrmacht could react. The traditional German approach relied on precise timetables and heavy logistics, but the Americans were improvising on the move, fueled by an endless stream of these tiny, indestructible machines. Wherever a bridge was destroyed, a Jeep found a ford. Whenever a radio line was cut, a Jeep carried the message by hand. The Wehrmacht could not strangle what it could not catch. As the Allies pushed inland, Jeeps adapted once again. In the Bocage country, where hedgerows turned every field into a fortress, soldiers welded steel bars to the front of their vehicles to cut through the dense growth. In the cities, Jeeps served as makeshift ambulances, weaving through rubble to evacuate the wounded. At night, their engines purred softly as reconnaissance patrols slipped behind enemy lines. In snow, they wore chains. In mud, they carried planks. They seemed to evolve with every environment, a living embodiment of Allied ingenuity. When winter returned to Europe and the Battle of the Bulge erupted in the Ardennes, the Jeep faced its harshest test. Temperatures plunged below freezing, fuel lines froze, and the forest became a labyrinth of snow and steel. Yet even then, the little vehicle kept moving. Drivers wrapped themselves in blankets, lit fires beneath the engines, and pressed on through blizzards to deliver food and ammunition to surrounded units. One war correspondent wrote, "The Jeep is the only thing that moves when everything else stops." In those desperate weeks, it was not just a transport, it was lifeline, courage on 4 wheels. By early 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and raced toward Berlin, the Jeep had become omnipresent. It led convoys, scouted roads, and carried surrendering German officers to Allied headquarters. Ironically, some captured German vehicles were replaced by confiscated Jeeps, proof that even the enemy now trusted its reliability more than their own machines. Soldiers joked that if you dropped a Jeep from a plane, it would probably land, start, and drive away. The humor masked respect. They knew it had earned its legend. Everywhere the Jeep went, it left a trail of stories, of soldiers rescued, missions completed, and impossible terrain conquered. Mechanics learned to fix it blindfolded. Drivers bragged about the distances they traveled without a single breakdown. To civilians, it symbolized freedom itself, a simple, sturdy machine that carried hope across battle-scarred lands. By the time victory was declared in Europe, more than 600,000 Jeeps had been built. They stood parked in endless rows on French airfields, muddy and battered yet still ready to run. The laughter of German commanders had long faded into silence, replaced by the rumble of engines that refused to quit. What began as a joke had become the heartbeat of an army. When victory banners began to rise over Europe, the Jeep's journey was far from over. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the same little machine that had clawed through European mud was now bounding over coral, volcanic ash, and jungle trails. In the Solomon Islands, on Guadalcanal, and later on Iwo Jima, Marines drove Jeeps through terrain so hostile that even mules refused to pass. They splashed through surf to unload supplies from landing craft, their engines coughing salt spray but never dying. Mechanics built snorkel kits from tin cans and rubber hose. They waterproofed every joint with grease, and the Jeeps roared ashore like amphibious creatures. Japanese observers, watching from hidden bunkers, were baffled to see vehicles darting across reefs and lava slopes, carrying radio antennas that guided artillery and airstrikes. The same mobility that had humiliated German doctrine now undermined Japanese strongholds, proving again that speed and adaptability could defeat entrenched perfectionism. On every island, Jeeps became bridges between chaos and order, ferrying wounded men to beach hospitals, hauling ammunition to gun pits, dragging out water tanks, and sometimes serving as chapels where exhausted soldiers knelt beside their muddy wheels. As the war reached its final crescendo in 1945, thousands of Jeeps waited on Pacific airfields, engines idling beneath the wings of transport planes. They would be the first to roll onto airstrips after bombing raids, bringing engineers and medics to secure the ground. When peace finally arrived, Jeeps were the first vehicles to enter shattered cities like Manila and Tokyo, carrying relief workers instead of riflemen. The symbol had transformed. Where once it brought battle, now it brought help. For the civilians who had lived through occupation and fear, the sight of a Jeep was like a sunrise. Its simple shape meant that order was returning. Children climbed onto its hood, farmers offered flowers, and soldiers smiled for the first time in years. Back home, America understood what it had built. Soldiers returning from overseas wrote in letters that they missed their Jeeps almost as much as their comrades. Newspapers printed stories of a warhorse on four wheels. Manufacturers realized the vehicle had transcended its purpose. It wasn't merely military, it was an idea. Soon demobilized Jeeps rolled onto farms, construction sites, and logging camps. They plowed fields that had once been battlefields. Civilians discovered the same traits soldiers had admired: strength, simplicity, and stubborn reliability. The name Jeep, once slang whispered by mechanics and GIS, became a brand carved into history. In the ruins of Europe, surplus Jeeps found new homes. French farmers used them to rebuild villages, Norwegian explorers drove them across snowfields, even former German officers admitted admiration for their resilience. One Wehrmacht engineer, interviewed after the war, said, "If we had built one machine like that instead of 10 complicated ones, perhaps things would have been different." His words echoed the lesson that the Jeep embodied: greatness does not always come from complexity. Sometimes it comes from clarity of purpose. The military kept faith in the little vehicle. It evolved into post-war models that served in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. But the original wartime Jeep remained unmatched for the purity of its design, uncompromising, honest, and nearly indestructible. Museums would one day display it behind glass, yet even there it seemed ready to start up and drive away. Its squared fenders and 7-slot grille became icons recognized in every corner of the world. For the men who once gripped its cold metal steering wheel, that silhouette meant survival. In countless memoirs, veterans described how the Jeep changed the rhythm of war. Generals could command from the front, medics could reach the wounded faster, and ordinary soldiers could feel connected to something larger than themselves. It turned static warfare into a living, moving organism. No one ever carved their initials into a tank, but many did into the dashboard of a Jeep. They trusted it, talked to it, cursed it, and loved it. And it repaid that loyalty with endurance that defied reason. By the time the last shots were fired, over 600,000 Jeeps had served across every theater of conflict. Together they logged millions of miles, crossed deserts, rivers, and mountains, and carried untold lives to safety. When peace parades rolled through Allied capitals, Jeeps led the columns, small, humble, covered in dust and victory banners. The laughter of those German commanders from 1941 was a distant memory now, drowned out by the roar of engines that had rewritten military history. In the years that followed, the Jeep became more than a relic of war. It became a language of resilience. Explorers drove them to the ends of the earth, aid workers through disaster zones, filmmakers across jungles. Wherever there was rough ground, there was a Jeep, and behind its wheel, someone chasing possibility. It was the mechanical echo of a generation that refused to stop moving. Looking back, historians often ask what made the Allied war machine so unstoppable. Some point to industrial capacity, others to leadership or moral cause. Yet among all the grand explanations, the Jeep stands as a quiet truth. Wars are not won solely by might but by motion, by the ability to adapt faster than the enemy can react. That philosophy, embodied in 4 modest wheels, helped free continents. So when we see the black and white footage of that little vehicle bouncing over rubble with a white star on its hood, we are not just seeing steel and rubber. We are seeing the spirit of men who refuse to yield, engineers who refuse to overcomplicate, and a nation that turned simplicity into supremacy. The Jeep was not born from arrogance or luxury, it was born from necessity and trust. It asked for little, just fuel and a driver, but gave everything in return. Decades later, long after the guns fell silent, one could still find Jeeps rusting quietly in old barns, their paint faded but their shape intact. Veterans would run a hand along the hood and smile, remembering the laughter of the enemies who once mocked them, and the long roads that proved them wrong. Because in every bolt of that machine lay the story of how something small conquered something vast, how faith in ingenuity triumphed over faith in intimidation. And as the sun set on the greatest conflict in human history, the world learned a lesson written not in books, but in tire tracks across continents: never underestimate what is built with purpose. For the Jeep, small, square, and steadfast, had conquered every battlefield and, in doing so, had conquered the hearts of those who rode it. It was the winter of 1941, and the world was already burning. Europe lay under the shadow of German steel, and across the Atlantic, America stood on the edge of uncertainty. Factories hummed with the restless energy of a nation preparing for a storm it could no longer ignore. In workshops from Detroit to Toledo, engineers and draftsmen bent over blueprints with sleepless eyes, chasing a dream that seemed absurd: to design a vehicle that could go anywhere, survive anything, and be built faster than any army could destroy it. The U.S. Army had issued a challenge: a machine that could climb hills like a goat, swim through mud, survive bullets, and yet be small enough to fit inside a transport plane. The clock was ticking, only 49 days to make the impossible real. Companies scrambled: American Bantam, Willys Overland, and Ford, each racing against time, each believing that if they failed, soldiers would die waiting for the mobility they deserved. In a cramped Pennsylvania workshop, a handful of Bantam engineers sketched late into the night, their hands black with graphite, their minds filled with urgency. Coffee cups trembled on metal tables as engines roared to life for the first tests. The prototype looked almost like a toy: small, boxy, a stubby nose and round headlights that seemed to blink through the fog. But when the Army officers saw it climb a 30-degree slope without slowing, when it crossed a river with water halfway up the hood, silence fell across the test field. They knew this wasn't a toy. It was a revelation. Soldiers gathered around it, touching its metal body as if testing the bones of a new kind of beast. They called it the Pygmy, then the Peep, and finally, simply, the Jeep. By 1941's end, the world would know that name. The Army approved the design, and Willys took the lead in production. Factories that once built family sedans now thundered day and night, stamping steel and tightening bolts with a rhythm that sounded like war drums. Every part had a purpose: nothing fancy, nothing wasted. A 60-horsepower engine that could pull 3 times its weight. A flat grille that doubled as armor against brush and debris. Foldable windshield, interchangeable parts, and a steering so raw that it felt like the driver was holding the heartbeat of the machine. It was crude, uncomfortable, loud, but alive. Soldiers learned to fix it with a wrench, a hammer, or a curse. It didn't care what you called it. It just kept going. In North Africa, the Jeep proved itself under fire for the first time. The desert was a graveyard of machines: sand-clogged engines, heat-melted rubber, and even tanks groaned under the weight of endless dunes. But the Jeep danced across that wasteland. It carried generals like Eisenhower and Patton across landscapes where maps failed. It served as a scout, an ambulance, a command post, and sometimes even a lifeline. The Germans laughed at it at first. Wehrmacht officers watched through binoculars as columns of Jeeps raced across open terrain, dust trailing like banners, and they smirked. "Too light, too open," they said. "One bullet and it's gone." But they underestimated what they couldn't quantify: the spirit of mobility. The Jeep wasn't meant to fight head-on, it was meant to outthink the battlefield. It went where tanks couldn't, where horses wouldn't, and where soldiers shouldn't, but had to. German reports began to shift from mockery to disbelief. Rommel's Afrika Korps noted how American forces seemed to appear from nowhere. "The enemy is moving faster than our intelligence can track," one officer wrote. The reason was simple: the Jeep turned terrain into an ally. It carried radio operators who relayed coordinates in minutes, it hauled ammunition through ravines that defied trucks, and it evacuated the wounded under gunfire. It became so vital that soldiers said, "If the Jeep can't make it, nothing can." Each one was more than metal, it was a promise that no man would be left behind. In American camps, soldiers grew attached to them, personalizing them with names and paint jobs: Lil, Dynamite, Faithful Sally, Born to Roam. Mechanics stripped the machines to bare bones and rebuilt them overnight. In the mud of Tunisia, one Jeep lost a wheel to a landmine, its driver replaced it with a log and still drove 40 miles back to base. In Sicily, another crossed a minefield dragging wounded men in its wake, its windshield shattered, its body peppered with shrapnel, but it made it. That was the Jeep's secret. It wasn't the strongest, or the fastest, it was the one that never stopped. As word spread, the German commander's laughter turned to something else, respect mixed with unease. They had their Kübelwagens, precise and engineered with German discipline, but they couldn't match the Jeep's improvisation. A Kübelwagen needed roads, a Jeep made its own. It could climb a 60-grade, ford streams, and pivot in the space of its own length. It wasn't elegant, but war didn't reward elegance. It rewarded survival. By 1943, the Jeep was everywhere: Africa, Italy, the Pacific. Generals rode in them to plan invasions, journalists used them to follow the front, medics trusted them with lives. One soldier wrote home, "You can tell where the Americans have been by the tracks of the Jeep." In war-torn Europe, villagers cheered when they heard the buzz of its small engine. To them, it meant liberation was near. In North Africa, Bedouin tribes called it the steel camel. In the Pacific, Marines swore it could climb palm trees. Everywhere it went, it carried stories. Some tragic, some triumphant. In one battle near Kasserine Pass, a Jeep carried the bodies of fallen comrades back through enemy fire. When it returned, its tires were shot to ribbons, but it still rolled on its rims. In another, an officer used his Jeep's headlights to guide lost paratroopers through a storm. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a companion. Soldiers would pat its hood before a mission like a good luck charm. It gave them courage, and sometimes, it gave them a way home. And behind it all, back in America, millions of men and women worked to keep it alive. Factory floors echoed with the rhythm of rivet guns. Women in bandanas tightened bolts, wiped sweat, and stamped Willys MB on metal panels that would soon carry soldiers across oceans. Posters read, "He's counting on you," and beside the words, a Jeep rolled through mud, a soldier smiling behind the wheel. It was the face of American industry, humble yet unstoppable. The German High Command, once dismissive, began studying captured Jeeps. Engineers took them apart, marveled at their simplicity. One colonel remarked, "It looks as if it were built by farmers, not engineers." Another replied, "Perhaps that's why it works." They couldn't understand that the Jeep wasn't designed for perfection, it was designed for the imperfect reality of war. While German vehicles demanded precision, the Jeep thrived on chaos. It didn't need luxury. It needed loyalty. As 1943 rolled into 1944, the Jeep's legend was cemented. It was there in Italy's mountains, hauling supplies up goat trails where even mules faltered. It was there in the rain-soaked fields of France, carrying generals through hellish artillery fire. It was there in the jungles of New Guinea, coated in mud, its driver singing to keep fear away. In every corner of the world, the same sound echoed, the rasping growl of a four-cylinder engine, refusing to die. To the soldiers who depended on it, the Jeep became more than a machine, it became a friend. When they slept in foxholes, the Jeep stood beside them like a silent guardian. When they moved out at dawn, it was there waiting, cold metal glistening with dew, engine coughing to life like it shared their fatigue. In letters home, men didn't just write about battles, they wrote about their Jeeps. One said, "She's got more scars than I do, but she's still going." Another wrote, "If she could talk, she'd have more stories than all of us." The Jeep had proven its worth. What began as a desperate experiment in an American workshop had become the beating heart of Allied mobility. German commanders could no longer laugh. They could only watch as the same toy they mocked carried armies across continents. In every photograph, in every film reel, there it was, small, sturdy, defiant. A symbol of how the simplest ideas can win the most complicated wars. And in that simplicity lay America's greatest weapon, not just steel or firepower, but the unyielding belief that ingenuity could conquer anything. By the summer of 1944 the thunder of war had shifted from Africa's deserts to the rolling fields of Europe, and at the heart of that thunder, still small and defiant, was the Jeep. On the eve of D-Day thousands of them were lined up along the English coast, lashed to landing craft, engines wrapped in canvas, each tagged for a specific unit that would soon charge into history. Mechanics checked fuel lines with trembling hands while soldiers leaned against their hoods, smoking, staring at the dark horizon where the greatest invasion ever conceived waited to begin. When the ramp doors fell and chaos erupted, the Jeep rolled forward into surf and fire, its flat nose cutting through waves, bullets snapping overhead like hail. Some stalled in water, others drowned, but hundreds clawed their way up the sand, pulling trailers of ammo, medics, and men who clung to its frame as if it were the only piece of solid ground left in the universe. It became the first vehicle to crest the dunes of Normandy, its tires digging into wet sand that reeked of smoke and cordite. From that moment the Allied advance was measured not just in miles but in the tire tracks of Jeeps. They raced ahead of armored columns, scouting towns, dragging wire for field telephones, ferrying orders, and sometimes dragging wounded men whose lives hung by the thickness of a breath. German observers in pillboxes watched through binoculars, confused. How could those open little cars survive such hell? But they did, bouncing over craters, weaving through wreckage, as if guided by willpower alone. When Allied armies broke out from the beaches, the Jeep became their bloodstream. Supply convoys stretched for miles, and at the head of nearly every one was that same square silhouette. The Red Ball Express, the lifeline that kept Patton's tanks fed and France liberated, was a river of trucks, but the Jeeps darted between them like nervous fish, carrying dispatches, leading convoys, clearing mines. General Patton himself favored one painted with his trademark stars. Eisenhower called the Jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. In every photograph of those months, dust, exhaustion, victory, you can spot it somewhere in the frame, its driver squinting into the wind, scarf whipping, a grin of disbelief etched on his face. They had tamed mud, crossed rivers, and outrun tanks. Now they were chasing history itself. Through autumn rains the Jeep never slept. In the forests of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, when snow turned roads into white tombs, the Jeep kept moving. Soldiers wrapped blankets around the engine block to coax warmth into frozen fingers. They tied logs to the tires for traction, poured gasoline straight into carburetors, cursed, prayed, and somehow kept them alive. The sound of a Jeep approaching through blizzard and shellfire was enough to lift morale in a foxhole. It meant supplies, rescue, connection. Even German prisoners, trudging through the snow toward captivity, stared in silence as the little machines passed, each one a reminder of how differently the Allies had fought this war, with adaptability instead of arrogance, speed instead of ceremony. When spring came and Allied troops crossed the Rhine, Jeeps led the charge again, ferrying engineers who built pontoon bridges under fire. The vehicles skimmed across newly captured German towns, flags fluttering, headlights blazing through the ruins of a Reich that once claimed to last 1,000 years. Civilians peered from cellar doors at the sight of American soldiers standing in those tiny machines, tossing chocolate to children. To them, liberation didn't arrive on the wings of bombers, it arrived on 4 small wheels. In every village, people would remember that sound, the rough sputter of the Jeep engine echoing between shattered walls, a sound that meant the nightmare was ending. And then came victory. As Europe fell silent and the Pacific still burned, the Jeep kept rolling, this time across islands with names that tasted of salt and blood, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. It leapt from Higgins boats onto beaches strewn with coral and wreckage, engines choking on salt water but refusing to die. In the jungles it carved paths where no maps existed, hauling wounded men through undergrowth so thick it swallowed light. Pilots returning from missions said they could spot Jeeps moving below like ants across the green chaos. When Japan finally surrendered and American columns rolled through the streets of Tokyo, the first vehicles to enter the city were not tanks or armored cars, they were Jeeps. Their drivers sat upright, weary yet proud, the smell of oil and victory mingling in the humid air. By the end of 1945, more than 600,000 had been built. Some were scarred, bullet-pocked, patched with welding scars and field repairs, but each bore the evidence of where it had been: sand in the floorboards from Africa, mud from Normandy, salt from the Pacific. Soldiers shipping home stood on decks and looked back at the crates below, at the Jeeps lashed for transport, and felt a pang of farewell. They knew those machines had carried them through the worst days of their lives and somehow made it bearable. Letters home described them with affection usually reserved for comrades. "She never quit," one man wrote. When the road gave up, she didn't. Peace came, and the Jeep transformed again. Its war paint faded, its star replaced by civilian colors, it found new life plowing fields, exploring mountains, rebuilding the ruins it once raced past. In Europe, villagers used abandoned jeeps to haul bricks and bread. In Asia, aid workers drove them through the rubble of bombed-out cities. In America, farmers discovered that the same toughness that had conquered battlefields could conquer soil. What had started as an emergency weapon became a peacetime companion, proof that simplicity could outlast chaos. German officers who had once mocked it admitted grudging admiration. It is, one wrote in 1946, perhaps the only machine that did exactly what men dreamed it could do. The legacy of that laughter turned respect would outlive them all. For decades, wherever there was rough ground or a road that needed to be found, a descendant of the wartime Jeep was there, on mountaintops, in jungles, at polar expeditions, and relief missions. Its shape became universal shorthand for endurance. When filmmakers recreated the Second World War, they always began with that sound, the coughing start of a small four-cylinder engine, a rumble that carried memory itself. Because the Jeep had become more than steel and bolts, it had become a heartbeat of an age that refused to surrender. And so the story ended where it began, with a challenge and an answer. The challenge was doubt, and the answer was persistence. The men who built it had 49 days, the soldiers who drove it had only moments between life and death. Both proved that belief in purpose can make the impossible move. German commanders had once laughed, seeing a squat little car they thought would crumble under war's weight. But history has its own sense of irony. That laughter was drowned out by the roar of engines crossing continents, by the cheers of liberated towns, by the whisper of tires rolling home. The Jeep, small and unassuming, had done what empires could not. It conquered every battlefield, not by power alone but by faith in the simple idea that mobility is freedom.